All right. Well, greetings, everyone. And I hope that you are finding the module materials in DMP 888 in the K-State online site somewhat logical. What I'd like to do real quick, if you can see this, is to show you on the course homepage, we have the module listing. And last week we did module 1, obviously, and now we're moving on to module 2. You do have a Financial Times newspaper article to read, and then 2 relatively short encyclopedia articles on the economic history of agriculture and cattle. And those will be important kind of backgrounders for the some of the later modules where we look at trade disputes. Just better understand the economic backdrop. But when you go through these modules, that's the right way to proceed. So you'll always post the recordings here, but the readings appear next. Then you have the quiz. I'm still giving you guys 2 weeks time to do that. And then if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, you can have it there too. So any questions, guys, about the module folder system? Okay, great. So today, we're going to talk about innovation and investment, and this is really key for understanding the global food trade, because the global food trade is not simply a matter of management and, say, scientific and regulatory effort. It's also the result of financial investment and technological innovation. And this is something that we have seen for centuries, and we'll be looking at some of the examples of this over the last century and a half and some of the relevance that we see today. So you're going to read in the Financial Times article a little bit about the concept of foreign direct investment in such places as Africa. You're going to have some readings in economic history. You're going to have a reading in agricultural history. And then I will talk today about the history of science and technology, which is alluded to some degree in the cattle encyclopedia article. In the world of sort of demography, where we measure population trends, one of the crisis issues or sort of alarming issues is the growing population of the planet. And this is no secret to those of you here at K-State Olathe, because you hear this all the time. But I thought this article put it cogently. A 70% increase in ag production is going to be needed to feed the more than 9 billion people expected worldwide in 2050, of which a quarter will be in Africa. So as the demand for food soars on a global scale, the greatest opportunity for profits in agriculture is in Africa. So it's this weird sort of statement, right? You've got the kind of social justice, food security argument, we need to feed the world, but you also see some hint of business opportunity, right? Some hint of that. This idea of maybe making money in Africa. What's that all about? Well, in the Financial Times article that you'll read about today, you'll see that many of the nation-state governments in such places as Africa, in this case East Africa, are actually embracing this concept. And this is perhaps worth thinking about in a modern-day context. And as you will see repeatedly in this class and in the textbook, this is an echo of what happened to the United States. If you will, the United States was sort of like Africa a year or a century and a half ago, in that we were the center or the attraction point for a lot of foreign direct investment. And whether it's investment in farmland, investment in timber, investment in livestock production, investment in sort of food processing, investment in transportation systems, all of those enterprises, being private enterprises, do have an opportunity to produce a return on investment. And therefore, in our global capitalistic economy, we have a lot of investing going on. There are actual entities, for example, in China, in the Chinese government, that are devoted to nothing else than to invest in South American agriculture and transportation, for example. And by the way, the United States, we are also heavily investing in South American agriculture and transportation. So you have this sort of bizarre situation on the planet right now, and have had for over a century and a half, where countries and investors are looking for opportunities for return on investment in the ag and food trade system. Proof of China's efforts here. We have, hello, how you doing? So Brazil obviously is a massive agricultural production powerhouse on the planet. And this is an image of it was actually an article sounding the environmental alarm with respect to deforestation, looking at an envisaged railway line that would be used to transport the commodities being produced in Brazil to the west coast of South America, and then obviously on to China. Barbara Tash, in a business magazine, explained the planned railway would connect Brazil's Atlantic coast and Peru's Pacific coast and would reduce the cost of shipping grain and minerals to Asia. Now, in December, when you all sit with me for your one-on-one oral exams, one of the things that we will talk about will be, tell me why countries might be investing in, say, railroads or shipping. And in this case, why are they doing it? Josh? Why is China investing in a railway? Let's see if we can come up with 2 reasons.
I mean, if you had a railway that would connect those 2 coasts, then you would, okay, so you'd reduce the cost of shipping the grain, but then you'd also reduce the cost of trading that grain once it reaches the coast. Less transportation once it gets to the sea.
And why would China be interested in that?
China is interested in saving money.
Yeah, and what's the demographic reality in China?
They have a lot of people. They're overpopulated.
Yeah, they're overpopulated, right? And well, actually, I mean, it's a bit of a statement of value. Maybe it's okay that they have that many, but what's happening is their middle classes are growing, right? And what happens when middle classes grow? You consume more, so there's a huge demand. But if you want to have affordable food for your population, you've got to have cheaper food prices, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe food price is one. What's another reason why Brazil would be investing?
Brazil, China.
Pardon me?
Brazil or China?
Sorry, yeah, China. Yeah, thank you. Why else would China be investing?
Well, wouldn't they also be able to get it there faster?
Okay, yeah, there could be some logistical, food, transportation. Maybe there's some, I don't know if there would be necessarily perishable products. A lot of it will be grain. Although we will touch on in this lecture the importance of the refrigerated beef trade in the 19th century. Yeah, go ahead.
It's one of the biggest areas for growth and production.
Yeah.
Biggest opportunity.
Yeah, it's just an area of opportunity. And with opportunity comes
Money,
right? And, part of the geopolitical power structure on the planet is economic, right? So, there's military The military sector is important for power dynamics, geopolitically, but also economically.
So would it make more sense then for China to have a lot of their grain and I guess minerals be produced elsewhere, since their company is, like you were saying, overpopulated and they can't really focus their resources on that thing? It's easier to just buy it from someone else.
Yeah,
In a way, how a lot of the produce and cattle trade is in the United States. It's cheaper to do it somewhere else.
yeah. What's that principle you guys may remember from economics? The principle of comparative advantage. Remember that one? Or big specialization. So if two countries are going to trade, it is better for the one that's most efficient in, say, making widget X to make widget X, and the one that's most efficient in making widget Y to make widget Y, and in a trade, you're focusing on your areas of efficiency. Okay. So the money for the investment will go towards building a railway link from Brazil's Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast of Peru to reduce the cost of exports to China. So it's not just getting things across, it's getting things to China. Okay, now let's go back to the 1800s, and this will be the context for much of the essay assignments in this class. This is the area that I'm personally intellectually fascinated by, and it features in a number of the chapters in the course textbook. So in 1862, Richard Cobden, who was a thought leader, kind of political, economic thought leader in Britain in the mid-19th century, was speaking to some manufacturers in the north of England, in places like Manchester and Sheffield. And at this time, this is sort of after the kind of completion of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, there had been an intentional decision, which is the same decision that Josh just alluded to, where Britain decided that they would like to free up some of their resources to do more manufacturing, and then allow other countries to provide them with primary staple commodities, including food, including wheat, including meat. One of those staple commodities was also cotton. And in the early 1860s, during the US Civil War, there was a disruption of that trade, and Richard Cobden was trying to address this issue in Manchester, where manufacturers were panicking because they couldn't get raw cotton from the South, in the United States. And he says, you get an article even more important than your cotton from America, your food. And he was right. From the middle of the 1800s on, Great Britain became more and more reliant, not only on things like cotton, but also on wheat and meat. And here's a graph depicting the consumption of meat in the UK during the last 3 decades of the 1800s. And notice that consumption grows. This is consumption by the British population. But the only way that extra consumption is being met is through what? It's the dark gray color. Imports. And those imports came from, amongst other countries, the United States and Canada. Okay? You could probably come up with a similar graph like this for modern day, say, China, where consumption is growing and it's being met by foreign sources, say Brazil. Okay? So you guys kind of see how the food trade in this economic story is helping to meet consumption needs. See that? Okay. Well, the production in such countries as the United States didn't just happen. There were people who thought ahead and saw ahead a business opportunity, kind of like what those business investors are doing in Uganda, kind of like what those Chinese investors have done in Brazil. And in the 1800s, many immigrants and financiers from places like London and even Scotland in the north of Great Britain, they sent livestock, farmers, and money to states like Kansas and Texas and set up British companies that were designed to bring a return on investment. And you can see how much they were investing. Look at the paid up capital on the right-hand side, okay? Now, the companies on the left, some of these are still in existence today. These are massive land and cattle companies that were primarily based in Texas. And, you know, the Brits did not invest in American livestock and meat packing and wheat farming and milling just because it was cool. They did it because they were seeking business opportunities, right? And this is really important because even today, you know, 140 years later, we still see the consequence of this. Many of the companies in the United States still have a significant proportion of their ownership in Britain's hands, people from Britain. Okay? And you'll get to read a little bit about a little bit more detail on why this happened in the reading on the economic history of the cattle sector. But because we're in Kansas, I want to tell a little story about, I'm not making it up, by the way, this is a real story, about a place in western Kansas, Victoria, Kansas. Some of you maybe have heard of Victoria, Kansas. There was a Scottish livestock farmer named George Grant, and he was from sort of the close to the Dundee, Scotland area. And if you've ever heard of, for instance, such breeds as Aberdeen Angus, a lot of those breeds had their pedigree histories traced back to Scotland, okay? And it was livestock farmers like George Grant that brought some of those breeds over to the United States. Well, George Grant decided that he would try to start his own colony and business venture in Victoria, Kansas. And it's fascinating because he, in many ways, was heeding the advice that had been given in a set of newspaper stories authored by someone by the name of James McDonald called Food from the Far West. And it was a investor prospectus telling stories. This guy had traveled to the United States and he visited a bunch of different places, including actually Manhattan, Kansas, telling stories about how ripe for investment orchards were, arable agriculture was, livestock farming was, et cetera, et cetera. One of the people that noticed that was George Grant. And so he moves to Kansas, goes out further west from Manhattan to Victoria. And if you look at the cover page to his prospectus, what's right smack dab there in the middle above Victoria? What words? Who's he writing this to?
To investors and settlers.
Investors and settlers. One of the things that we've seen in terms of the global trade dynamics across time is that people and money oftentimes move together. Okay? And indeed, George Grant was able to attract a number of investors, but also a number of settlers to come out to Kansas. And this was before the legends. Okay. It's really fascinating. Well, that was going on, and that helped to drive the production of food in the United States. It was then exported back to Britain. But eventually, there came a time where perishable food, most notably dead meat, was in need of some sort of preservation. Early on, a lot of the meat products that we shipped back to Great Britain were cured. So if you're at a dinner party this weekend and you're wanting to impress your friends, one thing you could say as you're like serving them like a Caesar salad with some bacon sprinkled on top or something, you could say, did you know that actually cured meat products were the first transatlantically traded meat products? Like that would probably impress your friends at the dinner party, right? And it makes sense, right, that we would trade first in cured products because cured products don't necessarily need to be refrigerated. However, when the beef trade took off, so in 1875, for example, Queen Victoria, she sampled some American beef and declared that it was very good. And then American beef just started growing in popularity in Britain. There was a need for a technological solution to getting the beef across the Atlantic from the United States. By all means, there was a way to bring live cattle over, and that had been going on. But as you will read here in a few weeks, that had its own set of problems because of animal disease. And what was needed was an actual technological innovation called refrigeration, okay, that would enable even steamships to bring frozen or chilled meat across the Atlantic. And it's utterly fascinating. One of the veterinarians who you'll read about in the course text is someone by the name of John Gamgee. John Gamgee was a public health activist and veterinarian. And he actually was the one who sounded the alarm about a number of the animal disease issues that we'll be looking at this semester. He also saw a business opportunity because he knew that the animal disease problems were not going away. There was a need to slaughter these animals on the eastern seaboard of the United States and export their dead meat to Britain. And so what did he do? He went and got a professional science master's degree. No, kind of. He went and studied thermodynamics. This is a veterinarian late in his career. He went and studied thermodynamics and learned how to make ice, okay? And he created London's first ice rink for the public, made money there, but then he figured out, along with many, many others who patented refrigeration units, how to develop these units that could be used on steamships. Keep beef chilled going across the Atlantic. And what does a patent signal? If you develop a patent, or why would you develop a patent?
Make money.
To make money. If you are a scientific innovator, you would like to be rewarded, right? And patents presume some business opportunity, right? And look at the growth of the number of patents being issued for refrigeration units during the second half of the 19th century. Isn't that amazing? Now, I would love to discuss here today with you guys the chicken and the egg phenomenon. What do you think came first? Trade or the refrigeration technology? What do you think? What do you think, Tegan?
I would say trade because he created the refrigerator because he saw the need for it.
Okay, you think it's that simple?
I mean, kind of, right? Like he saw a need, so he did something about it.
Okay, and then what was the consequence of the inventions and trade?
Then everybody wanted it.
If people can keep beef in Britain, then they're obviously gonna want more of it,
Okay.
so more trade.
What about how do you explain the increase in the number of patents there? Is that just because there's more scientists wanting to make money?
Because there are more people that saw opportunity in making money with this specific.
So there's more opportunity.
Advancing the technology.
Okay. And what is more opportunity evidence of?
Increased trade.
Increased trade. But wait, you said,
I did say.
but you can kind of see how I'm kind of toying with you guys. You can see how they're reinforcing, right? And that's an important principle that I want to make sure you own before we get into the narratives of these trade disputes, is to realize that globalization, especially in the food trade, is always and forever an interaction between kind of the positive growth realities of trade, but also the cause and effects of technological innovation. And this really, academically speaking, is the domain of what we call the history of science. So some of you, including some of you watching this on video, may, for other courses, need to, say, write a paper on something. And if you're looking for an academic discipline that would be good and appropriate for looking into, for, say, a paper on really any aspect of agriculture or food, you might think about the history of science and technology. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. Any questions or thought-provoking comments or grievances or anything like that? What does this make you wonder about?
If there's any roof on the opportunity and growth, and
Yes,
because
good.
back in the day everything was new.
Okay.
But
Yeah, that's an important question. Is it Costas?
Yeah.
Okay, am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
So Costas makes a good point. Is there a ceiling for all this economic growth and all this technological innovation? I mean, it's easy to see how, a century and a half ago, I mean, I've actually heard it described that people born in the 1850s were really closer in their experience to people in the first century than they are to those of us in the 21st century. So it kind of makes sense that there was a lot of opportunity, right? Everything was new, domesticating animals, as you'll read, setting out rail lines, starting farms. Of course, there was opportunity. But what about today? Have we reached a ceiling? What do you guys think? And maybe think about those readings that I'm having you look at. Let's pull this one up here. Do you think that there are still opportunities for innovation and investment, according to this article? Or do you think we are deluding ourselves and actually we need to pull back on investment and innovation? What do you guys think? Kostas, what do you think?
I think there is still, of course, opportunity, but the sector has to, for instance, the food production has to keep transforming.
Transforming, okay, that's a great word. What do we mean by that?
Like adapting in the new conditions.
Okay.
For instance, less arable land.
Okay, so we have less land, right? And we actually hit on that in the first slide or two of the talk, right? Less land. And you guys remember what percent increase in efficiency we need?
70%.
70%. And then you throw on the other reality that we certainly face here in the United States, which is the urbanization of society, right? I don't know when we crossed over. I think it was maybe 5 years ago. We became, in the United States, more urban than rural. We see that, I mean, actually right now in Houston, right, we see the effects of that, right? So one of the crisis issues in Houston with respect to the food trade is that, like most municipalities, they only have X number of days of food. And then if you shut down the transportation systems, right, which is what's happened, you have major food insecurity, right? So maybe innovation isn't maybe so much always about growth, but about that word that Kostas used, transformation. Making things more efficient. Actually, I have a colleague and friend who works for a major retail supermarket outfit here in the United States and has been trying to compel the sort of the powers that be in one of the corporations to think about ways to reduce food waste. That would be a transformation, wouldn't it? You know, it may not be so much, you know, getting more, producing more. It might be having a transformation of the food system to better preserve or save or reuse or recover what is already there. Okay. Other questions or comments? And by the way, this is very normal on the second day of class for 8 at 8 because many of the students who take this class, or not everyone in the class comes to the class with different backgrounds. So maybe that would be a good thing to do today. Why don't you guys just share like a 30-second background on what you actually have a research interest in? We'll start here with Josh.
So I'm doing a PhD in food science with Dr. Greg, and I have a lot of, I guess, clinical lab experience, microbiology experience. Just finished up a project on antibiotic resistance in cattle. So I guess that would sort of relate to this class, kind of talking about efficacy of antibiotic use and the economic impact that has versus like the scientific impact. And then talking about, you know, preserving the cattle population, you know, making sure we have healthy cattle so that we can trade those healthy cattle so that we can eat those healthy cattle. But yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Okay, great. How about you, Kostas?
I'm a PhD student in horticulture under Dr. Pliakoni, and my research is on post-harvest physiology, which actually really relates with what you said earlier, how to reduce food loss. Yeah, and really connects with like global trade or trade of horticultural products in the States even.
Yeah. And your technological innovation for reducing food loss could make every bit the contribution to the global food trade as someone producing more. So yeah, that's great.
No, I totally agree with what you said. Actually, it's, if you see how money are flowing in ag research, it's only like 7% of the grants are going to post-harvest projects, which I don't understand why.
Yeah, and that's maybe one of these days we can talk about why that would be, because that is a real problem. It's a huge, huge problem. So, you guys want to share, both of you, what your interests are? Are you the vice president for Corbion?
No, no, I have worked for Corbion for about a year. I started out in their chem lab.
Okay.
And now I'm document control specialist.
Okay.
And this is my first semester in a master's program working towards my food science. And I'm kind of interested in like regulation. And,
Who's your advisor?
Dr. Bragg.
All right, very good, great. And where is Corbion's headquarters? Is it KC?
Their corporation's in Lenexa.
In Lenexa. Okay, great. It's really fascinating. Lenexa,
It's
Kansas.
on 87th, isn't it? Yeah.
Lenexa is the home, used to be the home of some of the most impressive spinach farms in America. Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought of, Kansas City and barbecue and cattle and the growth of the livestock trade in America, but and certainly to some extent milling, but yeah, spinach. And then Corbion is sort of ingredient manufacturer. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So what position does Corbion occupy in the global food trade, in your view?
What position do they occupy? Well, I mean, they touch in a lot of different stuff. They bio ingredients and producing new, I guess, GMO products, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, that's wide range.
Yeah. A lot of penetration into different food products.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. Who wants to go next?
I got my bachelor's degree 100 years ago. I worked in
Wait, were you alive during the time of the trade disputes? That
Yeah, I was.
about?
Irrigation was just starting out when researching it, but so I have a little bit of background in that, and then I took a lot of ag econ classes, and I took a world ag econ survey class last spring, so we covered a lot of this
Great.
type of material.
Good. Tegan?
So I have a food science degree, and then I'm currently working at the Sensory and Consumer Research Center here at K-State Olathe. So I guess for me, I'm more on the consumer side of it. So I see consumers in focus groups or even in our taste test that answer questions saying, well, I wouldn't want to use this because the packaging is wasteful, or there's different parts, like you can't use all the products within the package. So it's just kind of interesting to see it from the side of the normal person rather than people trying to make new technologies or advanced technology.
Yeah. And one thing I would encourage you to do, Tegan, is you read the narratives. And by the way, if you guys do already have a copy of the textbook, you might go ahead and start reading chapter 2. That's probably the longest chapter of the book. And you'll have to have read that by module 6. But when you read these narratives, it may be interesting, for instance, for you to think about this through the lens of the food manufacturers, those that were milling grain and selling it across the Atlantic, or the meat packers who were, whether they were packing cured, say, pork products, or, using refrigeration and freezing works to send beef across the Atlantic. To think from their perspective, Tegan, you might be thinking in terms of what's going on with the consumer dynamic. And it's fascinating, actually, from a sensory perspective, that one of the concerns that the British started to catch on to was that when we started feeding, I believe, corn to pigs in the United States, Indian corn, it was causing a different flavor profile in the pork products that we were selling in Britain. And there was even discussions as early as the 1860s about the sensory differences in ham produced in the United States versus Britain. Of course, a cynic would say, everything in Britain is bland anyway, so who cares? But yeah, so anyways, I hope that you guys can, find some feature of each module to be relevant to your areas of interest. I'm going to hit you with a lot of history, a lot of economic history, and hopefully every module you'll get to kind of have a clear understanding of where you fit career-wise into the global food system, and maybe pull out some lessons learned. So, sound good? Great.